Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Matt DeBergalis, founder and CTO at Apollo. Matt, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks. It's really great to be here.
And since this is the first time we are talking to each other, we have been covering the company for so long, but this is the first time we are talking on camera. So I would love to know a bit about the company itself, since you are a founder. So tell me why you created the company. What problem are you trying to solve?
Well, sure. Apollo is a company that's about making app development more accessible. And what we've been working on is the question of how you, when you build an app, connect your UI to your data. And the idea of Apollo as a graph and GraphQL as a technology is a replacement for how app developers, when they want to build a user interface or a new experience, how they connect that experience to the services and APIs that are in the cloud.
Excellent. Now let's just quickly talk about GraphQL itself. Just explain to our viewers what it is and in what are the use cases where it's been used.
GraphQL is a new kind of API. Traditional APIs, REST APIs, for example, are point to point. So a service defines exactly how it wants to present data, and a consumer, that might be a Cocoa application on your iPhone or a web application in JavaScript, the consumer calls that API and gets exactly back what it asked for. That's a point-to-point API. The graph is different. GraphQL is a way to have the client express what data it wants. And a GraphQL API is adaptable, so it returns exactly what data the client's asked for in exactly what shape it's asked for. It's a lot more akin to a SQL query against a database, but with GraphQL, the data you're querying is the data that lives inside your microservices, your databases, any source of data that's in the cloud. And the big impact that GraphQL has over traditional point-to-point APIs is that it dramatically simplifies the task of application development. So much of the code you write when you want to build an application isn't about the user experience or the interaction or the UI. It's plumbing you have to write to connect all of those REST APIs to your UI. And the graph replaces all that with a universal layer. It's queries instead of code.
Since we are talking about kind of making it easy for developers, this might be out of context, but we are also seeing a lot of adoptions of low code and no code. How does that fit into that? Or these are totally two different words?
Well, graph and the low code, no code world fit really well together. It's like peanut butter and jelly. The low code world is all about how do I build my user experience without having to write code. And the missing piece of the puzzle is how do you connect that experience that you've built to the actual data you want to provide? With the graph, all that you have to do is you write a query. And it really is as simple as writing a SQL query. And so together, that's the magical experience. A developer can click around to build a user interface, write 10, 20 lines of GraphQL to express the data they need. And there is no step three. They're done. They've built the application.
What are the specific use cases from Apollo's perspective that either you are interested in or you are excited about?
Well, GraphQL is a mega trend now among product engineers. So the teams of React developers, Cocoa developers, the teams that are building user experience are voting for GraphQL. They're moving away from these traditional REST APIs and they're moving to the graph. And it's not just because it means they can go faster and write less code. GraphQL also gives you much better tooling. For example, you get strong types as you're designing your UI and your data flow. And you have extensions to your editor that can tell you how expensive a particular query might be. So you know how many milliseconds you're adding to the user experience as you build the application. And so what we're focused on Apollo is helping JavaScript developers and app developers make that transition. The stat from the State of JavaScript survey, I think, is 87% of JavaScript developers want to learn GraphQL. It is, I think, the most popular technology that's emerging on that side of the stack because it has this transformative impact on how quickly teams can build world-class applications that have a data-rich experience.
Before we started recording, we were talking about data graph and graph. If I look at Apollo, you folks look at it as a graph, which kind of unifies all your data, services, and everything else. So from you also want to understand is that how would you define graph or data, and how does it work with GraphQL?
Well, the graph is a new layer of the stack. And the way we think about it is there has been an explosion of capabilities inside the cloud. The whole transition to containers, to microservices, to APIs means that the data that you want to bring to your users is now coming from this wide array of systems, and they're all built using a different technology, a different language. The graph is a representation of all of those capabilities and services. So instead of calling individual APIs manually, with a graph, you're able to see all of your data in one place, and it's connected. So it's very natural to be able to talk about not just a customer if you're building, say, an e-commerce application, but you can go from the customer to their shopping cart, to the product in the shopping cart, to other reviews about that product. And it's a very natural way to express the relationships between all those things. And the benefit of that is that now it's enabled teams to build a much more rich experience. If you think about the best applications today, they bring together a wide array of different ideas, and they bring them onto the screen together, and they do that on web and on mobile and on IoT and in a kiosk, all these different platforms. And so the graph is the layer between your UI and your data source that makes that possible.
I want to quickly just switch a minor gear and talk a bit about culture and technology aspect, because we cannot not talk about people aspect of any technology. So if we do look at all the things that you were talking about, Graph and GraphQL and how it's helping teams, we see a lot of paradigm shift. We see a lot of shift left is happening. We also talk about things like DevOps, DevSecOps, and all those things. So from data's perspective, you can build technology stack, but how do you also bring that culture within companies so they start looking at things from that perspective? Can you talk about that?
I think it's a really great question, because at its core, Graph is a culture shift. The tradition of APIs has always been they're written by the back-end teams and they're handed to the front-end teams, and you get what you get. Graph is about changing the way that teams work together. In Apollo, we encourage teams to think in terms of the client experience. And GraphQL, the technology, was really built for the client and for the needs of the product engineering teams. So as we work with especially larger companies that are adopting a graph at scale, the biggest task is to help with that culture shift and the transformation it makes to how engineering works and how business works. Graph really fundamentally is a collaboration technology. And I think that's the other big story of the last decade. If you look at microservices, it's really about how do we help multiple teams collaborate together without stepping on each other's toes. And if you can do that, you can go further faster. If we look at React, it's really a technology for collaboration. It allows multiple teams to work together on a common UI at scale. And we've never had that kind of collaborative architecture for the data layer, for the API. And I think the reason Graph has spread so quickly, especially at larger companies, is that it finally gives us the answer for how can teams across a company, teams that bring different technologies, different ways of working, different workflows, how do we bring all of them together to be able to create something common, something unified that can serve the needs of the entire company, the whole of application development and technical partners beyond that. And that's what makes it really exciting, I think, going forward.
As you're talking about this cultural shift, there are two things. One is, even with all those movements that we talk about, on paper, they all look good. But in practice, how many companies are all actually practicing it? So that is also important. So what are you seeing in that space? Is there enough awareness about it, or a lot of work is needed to be done?
Graph is growing very quickly. We can look at, for example, the ratio of React downloads in NPM to Apollo downloads, and it's about 20 some odd % now of all web applications are using Graph. We can look at statistics from, for example, LinkedIn and see the rise in jobs around GraphQL. We can look at adoption in the Fortune 500. We think about 40% of those companies are using GraphQL now. And so to me, what's interesting is that this is a bottom-up grassroots movement. This is application developers are bringing Graph to their teams. They're seeing the benefit very quickly, and then they're able to grow and expand that. If you think about a graph, it has a network effect. It's more and more interesting the more that you add to it. So you start with one team, but pretty quickly the mobile team that sits next to you wants to be part of the graph, or you bring in another microservice so that you can convert another page of your application over. And that creates this momentum or a flywheel inside every company that's doing this. And I think that's, again, that ability to empower developers to bring better tools that also solve the challenges of shipping software faster, and the need for every business to be better at building software is really the fuel behind this trend.
And the next question that I'm going to ask, you actually touched upon the answer in the previous, discussion, which is more or less like, as you just mentioned, the kind of adoption that is there. Sometimes, there's adoption, but people may not be doing it in the right way, and you can say, hey, that's the wrong way of doing it. So if I ask you, are there any best practices to kind of, use Graph, more efficiently, so that these teams, when they do work on it, they are, fully optimized for it?
The strategy around Graph is really important. What we talk about with companies that are going down this path is to think strategically about the way that you're going to have a graph scale to your company. Again, you don't want a small graph and you don't want a lot of little graphs. The real prize is when any developer in your company can sit down and see all of the data and how it connects to each other. That's what's empowering teams to move quickly. So we work with companies on how do you build Graph in an agile way? How do you empower individual teams to own their slice of the graph while contributing to something that has a unified and common feel to it? The importance of governance. In a rapidly changing graph, you need to have a clear understanding of what the impact of change will be. API developers are used to very slow change. APIs don't tend to change very quickly, but the graph looks more like a product. The companies that are doing this best are shipping hundreds of changes to their graph every day. And so bringing some of the values that come from product engineering, the values around agility, around experimentation, around measuring your progress and having KPIs inside your team around adoption and satisfaction for the graph, those turn out to be good tools for accelerating progress while also having the bird's eye view and the control that any organization needs at scale for their data and for their application experience.
You folks recently made some announcements, and at the recent GraphQL summit. Just walk us through what some of the major announcements that you made there.
Yeah, we put on GraphQL Summit here in November. Our big topic is around graph at scale. Again, there's a network effect. So as teams go down this path, they find the graph gets bigger and bigger. A big part of what we talked about is federation. This is Apollo's technology for how teams can compose their graphs together into a unified graph. If you think about what Kubernetes does for containers or what design systems do for a React team, federation is that for the graph. And we announced some big changes that we co-developed with Netflix in particular. They're an example of a company that has a graph that spans hundreds of teams. We worked together on some changes to Apollo Federation that improve the ability to move quickly while preserving that consistency and that governance I talked about before. We announced our new Apollo router. So this is an implementation of federation in Rust. The advantage of Rust is that it's very fast. So performance is important for any team that's putting a graph in their stack. If you think about milliseconds mattering for e-commerce or for any kind of consumer-facing application. So we're really excited about that roadmap. And we talked a little bit about we have a solutions practice that work with our larger customers that are building graph at scale. And we've started to learn how to take the patterns we're seeing in larger organizations and bring them to the graph ecosystem. An example of that is contracts. So this is a feature we've built that allows a company to have a single unified graph, but then create a piece of that graph for a specific use case. A lot of our customers want to have a public API that's a graph. And they don't want to write that as a separate graph. They want to take their internal graph and then identify the parts of it that are appropriate to offer to an outside partner or to an outside developer that would want to consume it. And so we've started building a set of tools that are all about how you, on top of a unified graph, start to take advantage of that in different settings, whether that's mobile development or internal use cases or public APIs.
You folks are going to change your license and you're moving to Elastic. Why you make this decision?
Yeah, we've made a change to the Elastic license for the Apollo router that I mentioned and for Federation. The reason for this, and we're following in the footsteps of Mongo and Elastic and CockroachDB, Confluent, the company that works on Kafka, all of us have found that the value of development in open technology is incredible. Teams prefer available source code. They also prefer cloud services. And when I talk to companies that are adopting Graph, one of the things they talk about is how much they want to have their teams focused on the software for that company. And anything that they can consume as a service is an advantage to them because it helps them focus and go more quickly. So the Elastic license is a permissive license that's all about how do you have the best of both worlds? How do you allow companies to develop in the open instead of a proprietary approach, but also allow companies to have a thriving business model based on the cloud form factor that developers are so hungry for. And I think it's a model that works really well. And I think it's a model that you're going to see spread quickly across the ecosystem. The challenge we face is that Graph is a new category. It's going to require years and years of investment, new tools, new libraries, new technologies. And so anytime a company adopts Graph, one of the questions they have to ask is, how can I be confident that those tools are going to get built? How can I be confident that Apollo is going to be a partner of mine 5, 10, 15 years into the future? And it's important that we have a way to fund all of that work. So the idea here is that as companies adopt the Graph, we're able to funnel more and more into tool development and the technology that sits underneath that. And I think that's an important model moving forward for accelerating innovation and helping every company build on top of the Graph.
Matt, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about the company, of course, the adoption of GraphQL. And I would love to have you back on the show. So I'm already excited about our next conversation. Thank you.
Sounds great. All right.